Welcome to our week of discussing the Gospel of Mark. You might be wondering why we are starting with Mark instead of the first Gospel in the New Testament, Matthew. The reason for that is that Mark is the shortest and also the oldest Gospel in the New Testament, and we're going to discuss some of those issues with how the dating of those gospels works and the problems with sources and who was copying the other and that sort of thing, the so-called synoptic problem. But we'll get to that towards the end of this lecture. At any rate, we start with Mark because Mark is the template for the other gospels, Matthew and Luke for sure. So I'm going to give a brief overview of Mark and then move into a short discussion about the synoptic problem. What I cannot do in this lecture is give a comprehensive overview of Mark. We could spend an entire semester studying Mark, right? We're going to do this in one class period, and I don't want to take up too much of your time with this lecture because I know that you have an exegetical worksheet to do this week. You have your reading groups and other things, and so I want to be mindful of how much time the reading and lectures and assignments and forum posts take. So anyways, let's get started here. When we discuss messianic expectations in the Second Temple period, we should note that there's a history of this going back from the 1st century BCE. So that would be the years 100 to 0 BCE, before Common Era. Sometimes older literature uses BC, before Christ. There are many examples of failed messianic movements in the Second Temple period. Where does the word Messiah come from? In the Greek, it's Christos, which is where Christ comes from. And that is a translation of the Hebrew Mashiach, which means anointed one. And the root verb there, mashach, means to anoint. So in the Old Testament, you had many instances of a king being anointed, of a prophet being anointed, right? And this comes with, anointed by God is the idea here. You have non-human figures who are anointed. Think of the angel Michael in Daniel 12, who's anointed by God and also referred to as, the son of a human one. And then, of course, famously, you have Cyrus, King Cyrus of the Persians, who is referred to as God's anointed, God's Messiah in Isaiah 45. So there are messianic figures, people who are, no, I shouldn't say that. There are figures who are anointed in the Old Testament, but the concept of a Messiah as the ideal Davidic king, there's no figure who receives that status in the Old Testament. Some of the expectations that come along with this are that the Messiah is going to vanquish all forces of evil and oppression, right? Everything that's bad about the present age, the suffering of people, specifically Israel, the people of Israel, all that is going to come to an end when the Messiah comes, and the new messianic age, the age of God's reign, will begin. So in the Old Testament, there's no single messianic template. And I should broaden that to say in Second Temple Judaism, there's no single template for what the Messiah, who the Messiah will be, what the Messiah will do, and what that age will look like. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have evidence of a tripart messianic age, where you will have a prophetic Messiah, you'll have a priestly Messiah, and a kingly Messiah. And there's another Dead Sea Scroll text that just refers to the prophetic and priestly messiahs. So there's a diversity of of how many messiahs there will be, what they will accomplish, what their roles will be, that sort of thing. But notably, the messianic movements that did come to fruition in the Second Temple period, and you can read about some of them in your Jewish annotated New Testament. There's an essay at the back that is dedicated to messianic movements. It's noteworthy that all of these movements had a militaristic component to them, and ultimately all of them failed. The picture that you see in front of you, or the rendering of Simon Bar Kokhba of the Second Jewish Revolt, often referred to as the Bar Kokhba Revolt. He was regarded as a messianic figure in that revolt, even though rabbis later will refer to Simon Bar Kokhba as a messianic figure, though admittedly a failed one. One of the earliest textual pieces of evidence we have of what the Messiah will do and what kind of figure they are is from the apocryphal Psalms of Solomon. These are written in the first century BCE, and they don't exist in any modern canon, biblical canons today. However, the Greek Septuagint includes it, and the Syriac Bible, called the Peshitta, also includes the Psalms of Solomon. Read this passage with me. Raise up for them their king, the son of David, to rule over your servant Israel in the time known to you. Pause there. Time, right? That's a significant thing when we're talking about the Messianic age, when we're talking about Jesus and what his work, his life, his death, his resurrection, what that's all accomplishing. Time, fullness of time, fulfillment of time. This is a significant thing. I'm known to you, O God. Undergird him with strength to destroy the unrighteous rulers, to purge Jerusalem from Gentiles who trample her to destruction. I highlight that to indicate the militaristic aspect of this. And he will be a righteous king over them, taught by God. There will be no righteousness among them in his day. Maybe that should be unrighteousness among them in his days, for all shall be holy, for their king shall be the Lord Messiah. You'll recall this slide from last week's lecture, just to illustrate the old and the present age that's full of oppression, death, imperial hegemony, and then the Messiah comes, and the Messiah comes in violently and suddenly breaks into this, and the new age arrives, the new age of God's reign. Let's nuance this a little bit. We also discussed last week the various sects of Judaism, with the Sadducees and the Essenes or the Qumran sectarians, kind of representing a priestly side of Judaism, and then the Pharisees representing a more, I don't want to say rabbinic, but Torah study house oriented kind of Judaism, very similar to Jesus and his followers. And of course, you had the revolutionary Sicarii. But we're going to talk about another Jewish sect called the Way. Hadas would be the Greek. This sect is known as the Messianists, or the Christians by the pagan. That word Christians or Christianoi in Greek appears 3 times in the New Testament, notably all in a sort of pejorative way. Christians do not call themselves Messianists. That's a term that's applied to them by the pagans. They believed that the age to come, of course, had already arrived through Jesus Christ, through Jesus the Messiah. They believed that the Abrahamic, Mosaic, and Davidic covenants had been fulfilled in Jesus. And they believed that Jesus' death and resurrection inaugurated God's climactic liberation of humanity from sin and death. And that liberation, of course, had an eternal, otherworldly dimension to it, but it also had a this worldly present dimension, which a lot of theology today sometimes loses sight of that, right? And makes liberation and salvation all about the soul. It makes it a spiritual matter, and that's that's a divergence from historical understandings of salvation and liberation. The way, the followers of the way, believed that their citizenship was in heaven rather than in the kingdoms or empires of the world, which is a slight nuance from more typical brands of Jewish messianism, which was a very earthly kingdom centered sort of thing. And these early followers embarked on a global mission to spread this gospel, the good news that Israel's God was now the rightful ruler of the world. The illustration you have here is one of the earliest depictions of Jesus on the cross. And you can see it's like the head of a donkey. This is called the Alexamenos graffito. It dates to the late 2nd, early 3rd century CE, Common Era, or again, older publications will use AD, Anno Domini, year of our Lord. For this course, I will use BCE and CE for these designations, as those are the common designators in the literature, academic literature today. This picture you have a figure worshiping Jesus, who is depicted as a donkey on a cross, and this Greek, which you can see, it's terrific handwriting, says Alexamenos, worshiping his God. Okay, this is not a positive depiction of an early follower of the way. So now let's nuance this graphic a little bit. You've got the present age of suffering, but instead of a violent inbreaking by a Messiah and his armed forces, you have the cross. You have Jesus, the suffering servant, who dies, and that is the paradigmatic event that ushers in this new age of peace, of justice, and God's eternal reign. And that's it's a good thing to keep in mind when we're talking about just this concept of Jesus as Messiah. Jesus is not a military leader in the expected political sense of a Messiah. Jesus's messiahship is peaceful and just in both an earthly, temporal sense and also a heavenly, eternal one. So, what is the gospel? We can talk about this from an Old Testament background, Hebrew scriptures background. Consider Isaiah 52, verse 7. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. And if I had arranged this in the way that biblical Hebrew poetry is arranged, we would see that a number of things are situated in parallel, those things being peace, good news, salvation. Those things are all in parallel to each other. So where we have a mention of the good news in the Old Testament, this would be it. And in the Greek scriptures, that same word, euangelion, which is where we get gospel, the Greek scriptures would have this. There's also a Greco-Roman background that we need to keep in mind. There's a Roman imperial background. There's the Priene inscription reads as follows. Since providence, which governs all things in our life in divine manner, has with eager generosity bestowed the most beautiful ornament on our life by bringing forth Augustus, that is Augustus Caesar, whom it has filled with virtue to the good of the human race, as the Savior for us and for our descendants. The man who ends war and creates peace. And since by his appearing, the emperor has now superabundantly filled the hopes of all earlier times, in that he has not only towered over all the benefactors who lived before him, but has also robbed all future benefactors of the hope of doing more than he has done. And since finally the birthday of the God meant for the world the beginning of the gospel, which has him as its author, and it continues from there. Just consider here the language here. When we're reading our Bibles, we need to keep some things in mind. We of course need to keep in mind the Jewish context, okay? And I think the previous slide demonstrated that. Much more things demonstrate that. But we have to keep in mind the Jewish context. We also have to keep in mind the Greco-Roman context as we're reading these texts. They didn't emerge out of nothing. The authors didn't just make everything up. The words, the phrases, the motifs, the literary devices, the conventions that are specific to a kind of genre, like letter writing. These things don't emerge by themselves. They come out of a complex milieu of religious and social and political factors. And it's important to keep that in mind, because then you can look at, well, how do the early Christian texts, how do they draw upon their sources and the cultural elements of the day and adapt them to their specific purposes, right? How does Mark take this kind of idea? Okay, and I'm not saying that this inscription was right in front of Mark, but for something to be written in stone like this, it had to have been, in the culture. It was in the air, okay? So how does Mark take these kinds of concepts? The Roman emperor being regarded as a savior, as one who brings peace, as basically the gospel itself. How does Mark take that concept and adapt it and use it for the figure of Jesus, the Messiah? Okay, so some specifics on the gospel according to Mark, and this is a template I plan to follow as we continue, asking the basic questions. Who was the author? To be honest, it's anonymous. We don't know. The name Mark is a name that's applied later in tradition. I think we talked about this a little bit in week 1. So we need to keep in mind, Mark. I'm going to refer to the author of Mark as Mark because that's what we know. But when I say Mark, I'm not referring to a historical individual, even though there's a tradition going back to Papias, who is a bishop in the early 2nd century in Asia Minor. Papias wrote that Mark was one of St. Peter, the Peter who followed Jesus. Mark was one of Peter's assistants or something that followed Peter to Rome and then eventually records this gospel. This is not, that can't be historically substantiated. So for all intents and purposes, the Gospel of Mark, just like the rest of the Gospels, is anonymous. That, however, does not have to take away from from the message, from the power of the message that is that can be conveyed through this gospel. What do we know for sure? We know that the author of Mark was a Greek-speaking Jewish Christian. Okay. How do we know this? The author of Mark is familiar with the Old Testament stories and certain literary formulae. So, for example, the wilderness motif. Of course, this looms large in all biblical literature. Jesus going into the wilderness. You can find echoes of that in Elijah being served by angels in the wilderness. There's echoes of numerous miracle stories about Elijah and Elisha. Think about Jesus healing the leper in Mark 1:40-50, and then read the story of Elisha healing Naaman in 2 Kings chapter 5. Read the story of Jesus healing Jairus' daughter in Mark 5, and then read the story of Elijah raising the son of the widow of Zarephath in 1 Kings 17. Elisha multiplies loaves of bread in 2 Kings 4. Okay, Jesus in Mark's gospel multiplies loaves of bread in chapters 6 and 8. So these stories, right? The author of Mark has to be familiar with the Jewish scriptures. There's also the beginning of Mark is interesting, right? There's no, for those of us who study languages, there's no verb. The Gospel of Mark, or the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, according to the prophet Isaiah, there's no verb there. It mirrors closely prophetic formulae that we read in the Jewish scriptures, where we read something like the words of Jeremiah, son of yada da da da, right? A verbless sentence at the beginning, just to announce, like, here's what this is about. The vision of Obadiah, the word of Yahweh that came to, such Obadiah, Zechariah, any given prophet, right? There's this opening kind of prologue. So the prologue to Mark kind of echoes this sort of formula in the Jewish scriptures. When was Mark written? I have seen, I have seen ranges from like 62 up to 75 CE. So where's the significance in determining a date for Mark? Mark chapter 13 is usually where we get some of the apocalypse genre in Mark 13. Mark 13, 1-2. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." So, was Jesus making a prophetic pronouncement here, which would mean that he was speaking before 70 CE, which was the destruction of the temple by the Romans? Or is the writer of Mark writing after the destruction of the temple and using that event as putting the significance of that event in a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples? I've seen there are arguments both ways. I tend to be on the side of this is a 70 CE or slightly post 70 CE writing. But there are those who argue, usually the folks who argue that, I shouldn't say folks, the scholars who argue that Mark was written before the destruction of the temple, do so on the ground that because of the Jewish war, the first Jewish revolt here, which was a culmination of a lot of um, conflagration between the Romans and the Judean population, um, that for Jesus to say, not a stone will be left on stone here, was by no means a stretch of the imagination. It was probably something that people thought, wow, things are really bad right now. The Romans are, laying siege to Jerusalem. Like, this is probably going to happen. So there's that aspect of it. There's also, in the broad sense, does it matter whether Jesus predicted this event or whether Mark was written after 70 CE? Is the language in chapter 13 eschatologically, so that is referring to the end of time, the eschaton? Is the language in chapter 13 eschatologically oriented, or is it time fulfilled now in the first century? So that's something to think about in terms of prophecy. Is prophecy something? And this isn't an Old Testament class, but we could talk a long time about the prophetic texts in the Old Testament and what they are aiming to accomplish. At any rate, is prophecy always oriented toward telling a future event, or is prophecy about telling the truth about present events, telling the truth to people who need to hear the truth? Okay, so that we have to think about what the aims of prophecy are and the importance. Who is the audience? I wrote Gentile here, but it's likely that there's also Jewish hearers of this gospel. It seems to primarily be directed at a Gentile audience. When we go into Matthew, of course, that's going to be Matthew, famously referred to as the Jewish gospel, seems to have a much more Jewish audience than Mark. But as we've pointed out already, Mark's use of the Hebrew Bible, of the Jewish scriptures, and his familiarity with events and concepts within Judaism would indicate that he of course is a Jew himself. He's writing to an audience that is a mix of Jews and Gentiles. What's the purpose of Mark? To reveal the identity of Jesus as God's Messiah, the suffering servant, ushering in God's reign of peace and justice. And this idea about, like, who is Jesus? Who do people say that I am? He asks his disciples. Who is Jesus? Consider that in the first part of the gospel, roughly chapters 1 through 8, no one recognizes Jesus as the Son of God except for unclean spirits, God, of course, in the baptism, you are my son, the author, and then implied, you, the reader, you know that Jesus is the Son of God. But no one else is able to identify that, right? There's kind of the pivotal, hinge moment in Mark is when, Peter, where Peter kind of stumbles to this recognition that Jesus is the Messiah. So we can also there's a way that we can talk about, we talk about genre, right? What kind of writing is Mark? And the reason this is important is because if you go trying to read a book, if you go to try to read a text that's of a specific genre and you mistake it for another, so for instance, I'm going to go read I'm going to read the book of Genesis as if it's prophecy. I'm going to run into problems. Or I'm going to read the book of Psalms as if it is a letter. It doesn't work. You have to know your genre when you're going to study. So is Mark a Greco-Roman biography? So that is it? This is an idea that is put forth by many scholars. Um, is it meant to emphasize the virtue of a certain human figure, which is what the Greco-Roman biography did, right? It elevated the status, um, the profile of a certain figure to that of someone who should be imitated by everyone else, right? It elevates human figures almost beyond the horizon of mere mortals. But notoriously, Greco-Roman biographies do not focus on the death um, of their subject. So in that regard, this gospel doesn't quite align with that. Um, is Mark Jewish historiography, right? You can think about, and what I mean by that, a narrative that takes historical events and historical people and weaves them together into a narrative that is full of theological significance. Okay, think about the books of Chronicles, um, how, and how they retell David's life. Think about there are components in the prophetic books, Jeremiah, um, uh, in the poetic books, Lamentations, and of course Chronicles also, that are trying to make sense um, of the exile of Israel and Judah. Okay, so you take historic events and you weave them into a theological narrative to make sense of the senseless. Okay, so does Mark fit in with something like this? Is Mark purely apocalypse genre? Or the other thing is gospel a genre unto itself? That argument has been made also. The problem with saying that gospel as a genre um, uh, comes from Mark is problematic because, for instance, the Gospel of Thomas, which probably predates even Mark, the Gospel of Thomas is a collection of sayings, not a narrative. So if we were to say that Mark is the example of a gospel genre, like a new genre that early followers of Jesus created, we would have writings that fall outside of that model that don't seem to fit. And of course, we wouldn't have other extra biblical sources to go along and corroborate that. So what I would suggest, and what a lot of commentators suggest, is that you've got a combination of things here, kind of all of the above. There are elements of biography, there's elements of Jewish historiography, apocalypse, right, and sayings even. That genre of sayings, although that will become more important when we get to Matthew and Luke. What I've just done is all part of a broader um, um, critical approach to the Bible called genre criticism, right? You can use this on any text. When we're reading a book in the Bible, it's important to kind of get an overview of what the literary structure is. So for Mark, you can find commentators who advocate a two-part literary structure, right? Now, literary structure, how the narrative is constructed, what are the chunks, if you were to put it in outline form, what would it look like? 3 parts, 5 parts, up to 7 parts, okay? There's no consensus. How does one discern a literary structure? You can look for spatial indicators and geography in the text. So where do the characters, in one scene, where are they located? And then where does there seem to be a shift where they're in a completely different scene? This would mark some kind of literary transition. Look for temporal shifts. This happened at one time, and then, sometime later, you go to another event. Look for thematic shifts. In the case of Mark, you can kind of see a divide in beginning in chapter 8 and 9, where you've had Jesus and the beginning of his ministry, the gathering of his disciples, his work performing miracles or signs. Um, and then you move into his journey to Jerusalem, and then of course the Passion narrative. So that's a significant thematic shift. You can look for what literary critics would call an inclusio, and you can do this with any work, not just the Bible. An inclusio is a repetition of a concept or sentence, a clause, or a word at the beginning and end of a textual unit. Let's look at some examples. You can go to Psalm 73, and it begins with the sentence, "Indeed, God is good to Israel." And then verses later, it ends with, "For me, it is good to be near Yah," or literally to sit with Yahweh, my Lord. So you can see God being good to Israel, and then you end with this other word, good, to be near or to sit with Yahweh. And that word good, it appears only in that first verse and that second verse. So in older manuscripts, in a scroll, if you were reading a Psalm scroll, where does one passage stop and another pick up? This is one clue that you might have for that. We can go to James 2:14-16, and it begins with the question, what is the benefit? Ta aphelos. And it ends with that same phrase. What is the benefit? Ta aphelos. That's an inclusio. We look in Mark, we look for a broader kind of inclusio. The baptism scene in Mark is the beginning of Jesus's ministry, and it includes the scene where Jesus comes up and the sky, the heavens are torn apart. The Greek word there is schizo. When Jesus dies, the veil of the temple is torn, and that word schizo is used. So I would argue that it's not a haphazard use of that word that the author employed. The author was very intentional about saying, here's where Jesus is announced as the Son of God. He's announced as the Son of God, and you have this tearing apart, this rending of something, and in this case, the heavens. And then at the very end, at his death, when his work is completed, there's this rending of the curtain in the temple with the same verb, schizo. So you can look for inclusios. At some point this semester, we will also talk about chiasms. I'm not going to do it this lecture because it is a bit more complicated, and we have work to accomplish right now. But we will talk about the literary device called chiasm at some point, and that's another way that you can discern a literary structure. So for this class, and maybe to simplify things, let's present a 30,000-foot view of Mark without being too technical. You have your title statement or your prologue in Mark 1, verses 1-3. Then you have Jesus's ministry in Galilee in chapter 1, verse 4 through the middle of, or through 8:26. And then you have part 2, which is Jesus's journey to Jerusalem and his passion, his death that occurs there. So if we had lots of time, we would go through each literary unit and we could talk about this. I hope that the next couple slides model for you what I'm looking for in an exegetical analysis, in part, right? There are many things you can do in an exegetical analysis, but when you're approaching the New Testament text, here are some things to keep in mind, right? So let's start with the prologue. The beginning of the good news, Evangelion, of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah. See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. So you have here your Jewish readers would definitely hear gospel, and you would think of the Isaiah passage that we read, where we hear about the good news um, of God's reign. And here you have it's attributed to Isaiah, right? Mark, and this is an interesting way that authors would cite biblical passages. They're not always accurate. But then again, they're not. It's not like us, where we have a book and we can look in it and we're going to cite the precise sentence and the page number and all of this stuff. No, these writers, they have these things in their head. They know a lot. They know a lot of scripture, and so then what happens is things get conflated. And here you have it's not just Isaiah, but you have a conflation of Exodus 23 verse 20, Malachi 3:1, and Isaiah 43. But here Mark puts those on the lips of the prophet Isaiah, and that's fine. The concept here, the voice of one crying in a wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his path. In its Old Testament or Hebrew Bible context, this is a reference. This is a reference to the Babylonian exile, which is east of Judea, right, separated by the Jordan River, and a lot of desert and wilderness, right? This would be another good place where I should have had a map. Maybe I'll put one in there in post-production. But you take the captives in Babylon, and God's messenger is going to open a straight path back to Judah, okay? A straight path through the wilderness, not unsimilar to the parting of the Red Sea in the Exodus narrative. And so what we have here is this hearkening back to a concept that is that's prevalent to Jews in this time. This is likened to a second Exodus that's prepared by John the Baptist. And so it takes Isaiah's future tense and makes it, alive in the present. When we talk about baptism, we can analyze this in a Greco-Roman frame, all right? So Mark 1, 9 through 11, at that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open, right? We talked about that, schizo, and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." Okay, read this line about Caesar Augustus. Since Emperor Caesar, son of God, God Augustus has by his benefactions to all people outstripped even the Olympian gods. Okay, so it is commonplace for the Roman emperors to be referred to as son of God. So think about how subversive it is in a nonviolent way. Think of how subversive it is to refer to this figure of Jesus, who died in the most undignified, wretched sort of ways, as the Son of God. And then in Mark 15, 38 to 39, to add insult to injury, after the veil's been torn, there's a centurion, right? A Roman official, a Roman functionary, who is standing there at the foot of the cross. And when Jesus breathes his last, it's the Roman centurion, right, who says, "Truly, this man was God's son." I mean, how subversive can you get? How much more subversive can you get? So those two, so looking at that prologue and the way that Mark draws on the Jewish scriptures, and then looking at this baptism scene and how the historical Greco-Roman context works into it, then we get it helps us to draw out or to realize the meaning in that passage. Jesus' ministry begins, Mark 1:14-15. After John was put in prison, Jesus went into Galilee proclaiming the good news of God. The time, right? The time, significant thing here. The time has come. The kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe the good news. This is like um, this is like your thesis statement, right? Mark, you need to include a thesis statement somewhere at the beginning of your paper. Okay, here it is. So how does Jesus go about accomplishing his mission? What is kind of like his missional strategy? Discipleship is a core thing. Jesus called people to be and to work with him, right? He calls the disciples. Um, yeah, and in Mark 1:16-20, he calls the disciples, and then it says, and immediately they left their nets and came with him. That word immediately, as you're reading Mark, look for that word immediately. Greek elthus. It appears 43 times. Okay, Mark's gospel, it's short, it moves quickly, and it's amazing to see in these moments, and immediately this happened, and immediately that happened, right? And immediately they followed. It's what would you say? It's somewhat of like a literary signature of this author. So there's this relational dimension of salvation that Jesus talks about. It says, I will make you fish for people. Now, I want to draw to your attention, not only can we analyze the Gospels and the New Testament in terms of its Jewish context and its Greco-Roman context, but to some extent, we can talk about its philosophical context also. Consider that Greco-Roman philosophers were regarded as teachers with a loyal student following, right? You had the Stoics, you had the Peripatetics, and they all belonged to these philosophical schools. The Cynics, right? We can go on. And famously, and this is an interesting reference, the philosopher Pythagoras was referred to by another philosopher who apparently, they like traded barbs with each other. Pythagoras is referred to as a hunter of human beings. So consider that idea is in the cultural milieu, this idea of fishing for people, of having relationships with people, of establishing a teacher-student relationship. It's in the air. Right? And how many disciples does Jesus call and commission? Well, 12. And that's, if we're talking about the significance of numbers, there's 12 tribes of Israel, right? Again, Jewish context. Keep this in mind. Now, we know that Jesus's followership extended beyond these 12 men, right? Feminist critical readings of the Gospels will point out that there were women who played vital roles in Jesus's ministry. And maybe we'll get to this in another time. We have archaeological evidence that women played a significant formative role in the early church in terms of providing physical space for gatherings and providing resources, financial resources, and otherwise. Discipleship is defined as being with Jesus. It's sitting around him. It's being at table with him, and it's following him on the way. And what I should have included here is that it also might include, death. I'm trying to think. There's a rabbinic writing, Mishnah Avot. Avot means fathers. Mishnah Avot, there's a passage, it's in the opening, Mishnah Avot 1:4. It talks about sitting in the dust of your home should be an open place for the rabbis or the teachers, and you should absorb their dust like while they're in your space. And the idea there being you're soaking up, you're absorbing everything that they say. And so that kind of what that concept of a teacher, of a rabbi, this, is central to this early Judaism. And here, early followers of the way, followers of Jesus. There's some themes. We can't touch on everything in the Gospel of Mark, but there's the messianic secret in Mark, where Jesus commands people that he has healed. He commands onlookers, his disciples, the demons that he exorcises. He tells them to be silent. Don't tell anyone about this. But of course, well, okay. Where does this idea of a messianic secret? German scholar William Frede is the first to posit that, he uses this term messianic secret to say that Mark, the writer of Mark, invented this secrecy motif, that it is not authentic to the historical Jesus. Frede has been criticized in various ways for this. It's not to discredit his work. He's a figure that looms large in New Testament scholarship, but there are other ways of looking at this secrecy motif. And even if Mark invented this kind of motif, the irony, of course, is that it's not a secret. It gets out anyways, both in the text, in the narrative itself, but also historically, the word gets out. Okay, so, but why? Why the secrecy? Does Jesus do this to protect himself from false messianic expectations? Is it to prove that faith cannot be coerced by spectacle? Or there's the fact that it's only at the cross, right, at the end of Mark's gospel, that Jesus can rightly be understood, right? That moment that the centurion has his confession. There's also another way to look at this. In Roman imperial, emperor worship, so to speak, there's this refusal of divine honor, right? That honor, Aristotle writes, honor is the object with which the great-souled kings are concerned, since it is honor above all else which great men claim to serve. And so there's this customary thing that Roman emperors would do, where they would, they're supposed to embody piety and they're supposed to shun divine honor, even though they're everyone believes, and part of the emperor cult is that they are divine themselves. But they're supposed to make a public display of like shunning this honor, right? Oh, no, that's not us. Basically, they make an appearance of this philotimia, right? That they don't want this honor. But then the thing in Mark is that Jesus actually repudiates honor. He doesn't want to be known, and he ultimately dies a very, a terrible death, an unremarkable death in this time. So where the Roman emperors put on a show of shunning honor, Jesus actually does. And you can read this again as like a subtle critique of Roman rulers' false piety. So what's going on with the ending of Mark, right? Mark ends at 16:8. I think in your Bibles, you'll see like a bunch of parentheses or brackets. In the Jewish annotated New Testament, what do we have? Okay, so it ends at 16:8, and then we have the shorter ending of Mark and the longer ending of Mark. These are most likely later editions. The picture I have here on the screen is, the earliest full copy of Mark in Codex Sinaiticus, and you're looking at the end at 16:8, where you see those two lines, and then at the bottom you see the gospel according to Mark. And then, at the top, you go up to the right and it says, according to Luke, right? And Luke starts. So at any rate, you judge for yourselves if this, as the earliest manuscript, full manuscript of Mark, is it likely that this end, cut off a lot of cut off the longer endings and ended here, or is it more likely that this is representative of the more widespread version of Mark, and then you have other manuscripts, manuscript traditions that have added those longer endings, and that's where you would get into another kind of biblical criticism that we call textual criticism, where you analyze different textual families, different manuscript traditions of a book, and you have to make judgments on, did a scribe make a mistake, or did a scribe intentionally introduce something or take something out of a text? And in this case, I would argue that on the grounds of textual criticism, from a thematic standpoint, from a number of things, these just look like additions that were made to, what would you say, dress up the ending of Mark, which ends with the women finding out that the tomb is empty and they go away scared. There might be a lot of theological significance and intentionality for Mark in ending there. And then adding these other endings, what does that do? How does that fit with the rest of Mark's narrative, right? You can analyze all of these things. Okay, let's talk briefly about the synoptic problem, right? So part of your first paper coming up with the analysis of a gospel pericope or section of text is that you can hold the text of Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side, the same story. And when you lay them out like this, like you see this picture here, like you'll see in Throckmorton's book, you can easily see the differences. Look, unsurprisingly, Mark here in the story of the temptation, much shorter than the other two. You can do this across the board. Is this plurality that we talk about and the differences and variety here, is it a theological problem, right? Do we want to seek to harmonize all of these things? Or is it a theological opportunity to say that, early Christianity was diverse. There are a variety of ways at looking at Jesus's life and drawing the significance from that. And that it is okay for that diversity to fit, that plurality to sit side by side. Okay, if we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call these the synoptic gospels because literally they are seen together. 90% of Mark's gospel appears in Matthew. 50% of Mark's gospel appears in Luke. And Mark only has 55 verses that are unique to his gospel. So what's the solution here? Who is using who? Who came first? Did separate authors remember these stories verbatim? This is what we're going to get into, the area of like source criticism and form criticism. And let's just enjoy how complicated this can get. Okay, so up until the 19th century, it was believed that Matthew was the earliest gospel. This goes back to St. Augustine, who wrote about this. It's only very recently in biblical scholarship. Recently, it's only within the last 100 years or so that Mark was established as the earliest gospel, and we call that Markan priority. And so this theory goes that you have Mark, and then you had the Gospels of Matthew and Luke who used Mark as a source. Okay, but the problem with this, well, I shouldn't say it's a problem. If you want to know exactly who used who and what sources they had, you're left with the amount of material in Matthew and Luke that's not accounted for in Mark. For instance, like the Sermon on the Mount, or the Sermon on the Plain, the Lord's Prayer, a number of sayings of Jesus, a number of important things that the birth narratives, a number of the things that are central to Christian identity and the liturgical year, you don't find in Mark. Where did Matthew and Luke get them? Okay, so what scholars came to was, a two-source theory, right? So Matthew and Luke used Mark, but there was also another source called Quelle, which is German for source. Q is a hypothetical document. No such document exists. This is a theory to account for all of the material in Matthew and Luke that is not found in Mark, okay? There's a four-source theory, because then even after you do the two-source theory, you still have material that's specific to Matthew, and you have material that's specific to Luke, okay, that's not accounted for elsewhere once you establish what hypothetically would be in Q. The four-source theory says that in addition to Mark and Q, Matthew had his own special source, or M, and Luke had his own special source, and that's L. Okay, so there's the four-source theory. A more recent theory is called the Farrer hypothesis. And this is that Mark, of course, is first, but that you then had Matthew. Matthew drew on Mark, and then Luke drew together the Matthean tradition and the Markan tradition into itself. So, talking about source criticism, this is very applicable if you've taken your Hebrew Bible or Old Testament class already, when you're talking about what are the various sources that are indicated in the biblical text there. Here, we want to figure out which sources were used for which writings. So who did Matthew, who did Luke use? Trying to reconstruct that. The problem is that this is all hypothetical work. I do not subscribe to the Q tradition, and that is mainly because there's no evidence for it. You're basically saying all of the material that Matthew and Luke don't share with Mark must have come from one other source. That doesn't exist. I can't accept that. That's my position on that. The Farrer hypothesis gets a little bit closer because it attempts to work with the evidence we have. Okay, there's nothing hypothetical. There's no hypothetical source here. What is hypothetical is this sequence of textual transmission and development. So what the Farrer hypothesis does is instead of taking what we would call synchronic view, right, a one-shot view of, a one-shot view of the sources right here. What the Farrer hypothesis does is it says, okay, Mark was first, then the second stage was Matthew, and then the third stage was Luke. That's great in that it doesn't include the hypothetical Q source, but it is a hypothetical transmission process, or compositional editorial process that I still have a hard time accepting. But it gets it's a model that is that I'm more comfortable with than the others. But this is something that you can think about and that you can study. And if you have questions about it, we can talk more about source criticism and how we do this kind of how we do this kind of thing. Thanks for tuning in this week. Yeah, as always, if there are things that you have questions about, certain things that maybe I glossed over or didn't include, by all means, please send me an email. Come to the open office hours on Thursday night. We had a great discussion last week. But anyways, peace, everybody.